Things are not as they appear to be. And in Washington, that's not unusual. In fact, that may be the norm, that in Washington, things are often not what they appear to be. If you follow the news, you've been seeing reports of Elon Musk and DOGE and getting rid of waste and fraud and abuse by the billions, if not trillions of dollars. And yet we are meeting here today, though, because Congress, namely the Senate, wants to increase federal spending. So on the one hand, you have Elon Musk and DOGE and the Democrats complaining to high heaven, he's cutting too much, they're cutting too much. And Senate Republicans are coming forward today to pass a budget to allow them to raise federal spending. What gives? Are Republicans for getting rid of waste, fraud, and abuse and reducing the deficit, balancing the budget, as the president says? Or are they really for increasing spending $340 billion? The budget that we will vote on will allow increased spending in the military by $150 billion, increased spending for the border $175 billion, $20 billion for the Coast Guard. It adds up to about $340 billion. Well, if we were fiscally prudent, if we were fiscally conservative, why wouldn't we take the savings from Elon Musk and DOGE and move it over here and help with the border? Why would we be doing a brand new bill to increase spending by $340 billion? That's because the Senate is acting as it always has. The Senate hasn't gotten the message. President Trump came to town, a new way of thinking. They're shuttering agencies, they're shutting people down, they're finding things like $2 million spent in Guatemala for sex changes, $3 million spent in Brazil for girl-centric climate change, $4.8 million spent in Ukraine for social media influencers. While you're at it, we spent, not we, but the people who vote for this, I've voted against all of this, but the members of the Senate who voted for this spent several $100,000 sending designers in Ukraine to the fashion show in Paris. It goes on and on. Thousands of dollars for a trans opera in Colombia, more thousands of dollars for a trans comic book in Peru, hundreds of thousands of dollars spent studying rats to see if lonely rats use more cocaine than well-socialized rats. Guess what? Lonely rats love the cocaine. You spent hundreds of thousands of dollars of your money on this craziness. Why not take that crazy spending that DOGE and Elon Musk are finding and move it over to securing the border? Instead, fiscal conservatives are faced with a bill they're putting forward to just simply increase the spending. I'm all for moving it around. I'm all for saving it from the craziness and pushing it over into something more valuable. There is a procedure for doing this. It's a special procedure, doesn't require any Democrat vote. It can happen through simple majority, and it has a fancy name. It's called rescission. So all the administration would have to do is bundle together several $100 billion of savings, which it appears they're finding, bundle it together in one bill, send it back to us, and by simple majority, without any help from the Democrats, Republicans could cut spending. Instead, things aren't what they appear to be. You see all this great work being done to cut spending, to cut waste, fraud, and abuse, and then you see the Senate acting. We're going to vote all night long to set up a bill to increase spending by $340 billion. There is a true philosophical debate within the Republican Party and really within both parties about what the biggest threats to our country are. Are the gravest threats to America from within or from without? I would argue that they're from within. I don't lay awake at night fearing foreign invasion, that invaders are coming to our shores any moment. Doesn't mean we shouldn't be prepared, that we shouldn't defend ourselves, but it does mean that we don't have to have unlimited spending on our military. Look, many of my family have served, soldiers have to be paid, and we should take care of them. But at the same time, we shouldn't be everywhere around the world all the time. We spent close to $300 billion in Ukraine. We got soldiers all over Africa. We got soldiers in Syria, We got soldiers everywhere. We don't need to be doing that. If you want to put our military money and spending in perspective, we spend more than the next 9 countries combined. It's not that we're spending too little, we're spending a lot. But if you decide that you want more money for the military, take it from the climate change, the girl-centric climate change in Brazil. Quit spending your money overseas. Over the years, we've given Egypt nearly $60 billion. Who runs Egypt? A general, where there are no elections, kind of like Ukraine, where there's a president, but he doesn't have to run for re-election because he's canceled the elections. Why in the world will we be giving money hand over fist to dictators and people who don't stand for election? In Egypt, we gave it to one family, the Mubarak family. When he was finally ousted from power, he had $20 billion on him. Well, it actually wasn't all on him. A lot of it was in Swiss banks and all over the place, but he was worth $20 billion. And that's nothing. Each of his kids were worth another $5 billion. So he basically was able to steal $30 billion of the $60 billion that American taxpayers sent to Egypt. That's foreign aid. That's a story of your foreign aid, is you've been being ripped off decade after decade. But while Elon Musk and DOGE are doing their job, working overtime till late at night, finding us those savings from foreign aid, send them back. We spend $40 billion in foreign aid. You could send $30 billion back, and America would be safer and stronger, and you could put the $30 billion towards either to the military or to the border, your choice. There's money like that can be saved and moved around, but it's going to have to come back. Ultimately, all the talk of the savings is ephemeral. It isn't real until Congress has the courage to vote on it. It has to be certified by a vote. If Congress doesn't vote, it sort of wishes and washes around in the ether, and it may or may not wind up being savings. Ultimately, Congress is going to have to do their job. But what we're doing today, the vote on the budget is not doing our job. What we're doing today, which will be a Republican-led effort, minus me, will be an effort to tee up a bill to increase federal spending. I would say let's take the savings that we're finding, move that over to any accounts, do it through a vote of Congress, do it through a simple majority. It can actually be done even without the budgetary process. A rescission package can be sent back without even going through the whole budget problem. What we are faced with, though, is come the end of the year, we're halfway through the year. So we're voting on a budget today that is really somewhat of a fiction because the year's already half over. We know what's being spent. We know in the end, we're going to spend a little over $7 trillion this year. The problem is we're going to bring in about $5 trillion, and we're going to spend about $7 trillion. We're $2 trillion short. They're getting ready within weeks to add a couple $100 billion for California. Now look, it's appropriate to have sympathy for people in their plight, but it is not good for the country simply to borrow money to send it to anyone. We should be, if we're going to help people in need, we should be taking that money from the taxes that come in. We shouldn't be borrowing it from China and sending it to California. No matter how noble the purpose it is, we should be spending what comes in. We should not be borrowing a penny. But come the end of the year, we're going to be over $2 trillion in increased debt for 1 year. What's our total? Our total is going to be over 37, maybe 38 trillion by the end of the year. Interest? The largest item in our budget is now interest. About $1 trillion in interest every year. One estimate is over the next 10 years, it'll be like $14 trillion in interest. Now, interest doesn't buy anything. Interest isn't feeding anybody. Interest isn't putting out fires in California. Interest is simply wasted because of the profligate ways of both parties. People voted for a change. They said, we're going to get a change. They like what Donald Trump is doing. They like what DOGE is doing. They like what Elon is doing. And yet here we are. The Republicans are acting like the Democrats. They're going to vote to increase spending by $342 billion. It's all going to be borrowed. Now you could say, well, as some will say, we're going to cut spending to equalize the money we're going to spend here. But none of that is listed in the budget. Now, the House has a budget. The House Republicans have passed a different budget. And in their budget, they list $1.5 trillion worth of savings. They have to get to this. They cannot do their special simple majority vote, the reconciliation vote, unless they find $1.5 trillion. In the Senate bill, there's $4 billion. Now, they will say that's just a floor. We're gonna find more than that. But all they would promise was the 4. In the House, they realized that's not really believable. That's not really comforting. So the House said, no, we're doing $1.5 trillion. So as this debate unfolds over the next 10, 12, 15 hours, we'll be here for a long time. You know, get your popcorn, turn your C-SPAN on. But as this unfolds, I will offer an amendment, and my amendment will say, let's alter the budget to not only say we're going to increase spending by $340 billion, my amendment will say we should cut spending to pay for it by $1.5 trillion. Ideally, we'd do this simply by bringing a rescission package of the savings that Elon and DOGE is finding. But it would work this way as well to at least show that we are serious about this. Because I've seen this happen again and again. And I know what the story is going to turn out. I know that come September, which is the end of our fiscal year, we're about halfway through it. As we get to the end of the fiscal year, Republicans are going to be going, I got to go home and explain to people that the deficit is $2.2 trillion, one of the worst years ever. And I got to explain to people, Republicans are in charge, we're taking care of it now, when it looks like the problem's getting worse. We have to immediately start cutting spending. Every Republican needs to be voting to cut spending. There is a way to do it. It's called a rescission package. If you continue to borrow, though, if you think I'm going to be nice to everyone and give everyone money, you can do it, but the borrowing is going to crowd out everything because we've made many, many promises. We have promised people Medicare. We've promised people Medicaid. We've promised people Social Security. We've promised people food stamps. Oh, guess what? That's equal to all of our tax revenue. Those 4 promises, Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps, Social Security, that equals all of our tax revenue. We don't even vote on those programs. The programs that we vote on, that is the budget, that is military and non-military, is 1/3 of the spending. It's all borrowed now. Essentially, our debt equals our budget. Everything we vote to spend in the budget is borrowed. So things are out of whack. You can't help everyone and be everything to everybody. A way to look at this is, let's say you make $25,000 a year, and all of your money goes to your rent and your food and taking care of your family. You've got nothing left over. You are working poor. And you walk by somebody on the side of the street and they are homeless and you feel sorry for them. Would you immediately go to a bank and borrow $1,000 and give it to a homeless person? No, you wouldn't, because that would make no sense whatsoever. That's what we are doing. We look around the world and we see homeless people. We look around the world and we see hungry people. So we just simply go to China, the bank, and we borrow money from China and then we send it to Africa. Well, you know what? If you send your own money, it's charity. If you send your own money, it's noble. If you send somebody else's money or you borrow the money and you make the country go further in debt and you put us more in peril, that's not charity. That's what's destroying our country. That's what's eating us up from the inside out. The gravest threat to America is from within, not from without. What happens when the currency unravels? What happens when the value of the dollar doesn't lose 5% in a year, but loses 5% in a week? That's what happens in the end stages of a currency being destroyed. People say it'll never happen to America. Can't happen in America. We're the strongest dollar. We're the reserve currency of the world. Can't happen here. It can and has happened to great nations. It's happened to great civilizations that have lost their currency, that have destroyed their currency. Does it always unravel gradually enough that you can fix it? No, sometimes it unravels in the space of weeks. When the German money lost its value in the early 1920s, after the First War, in September, it took like 100 marks to buy a loaf of bread. 2 weeks later, mid-September, it was 1,000 marks. At the end of September, it was 1 million. Middle of October, it was 10 million. The currency, if you look at the currency and what it would buy in a 2-month period, was completely destroyed in a 2-month period. The pictures from the history books will show people putting the German mark into wheelbarrows, wheeling it up to fires to burn for warmth. It was worth more as fuel than it was to buy things. The workers were demanding they be paid more than once a day because you had to go out and get your pay at noon and spend it then because it was worth half as much by the end of the day. That's what it looks like when a country destroys its currency. How do you destroy your currency? How does inflation occur? If you watch television, you see these people who are either dishonest or would fail basic economics. They're like, well, inflation's transitory and, we're not sure what it's from, but maybe it could be, greedy people owning grocery stores causes inflation. No, inflation is an economic fact. It comes from borrowing money, and the Federal Reserve prints up money to buy the borrowed money. Treasury loan, we get behind on our payments. We spend more than comes in, so we have to borrow money. The Fed buys our Treasury bills. But the Fed doesn't have any money. The Fed creates that money. That's what inflation is. And so much of it gets passed on to government. So everybody knows in the last 3 or 4 years, and part of the election was over the inflation of the Biden administration. Prices were up over about a 20% period over 3 or 4 years. But in order to keep up with that, we've built in inflation protection to most of our government programs. So Social Security has cost of living increases. So they keep up with the inflation or try to keep up with inflation. And as they do, the programs just get larger and larger and larger, and we get more and more behind the 8 ball. That's what's happening. But it's coming to a head. Social Security runs out of money in 2033. When it runs out of money, everybody gets 20 to 25% less in Social Security. What do you think is going to happen in our country when the poorest among us who live only on Social Security, when they lose the value of their check and they lose 25% of their check? What do you think is going to happen in this country? And nobody's preparing for it. Nobody's doing anything to reform Social Security, reform Medicare, reform Medicaid. People are just petrified of everything. What is so horrible and so hard to say that people are able-bodied ought to work? I think everyone should work. I think everyone who is able-bodied should work, not as punishment, but as reward. We should have a work requirement on every check that goes out. Everybody should work. It's how you get your self-esteem. You can't give people self-esteem. You can't say, here, Johnny, here's a trophy. We know you can't spell or add, but here's a trophy for being a mathlete. No, you have to earn your self-esteem. You earn it through work. Just adding work to Medicaid and saying, you want free health insurance from the government? Adding a work requirement saves $100 billion. Having the states pay more for Medicaid. Why do I want the states to pay more for Medicaid? Because they don't have a printing press. Why are the decisions of this body so awful? Because there's a printing press. I had a conversation with one of my Democrat colleagues, and I said, we have to make a choice. You've got to decide whether you want to help the poor in our country or want to help the poor in Ukraine or help whoever you're paying in Ukraine. And he says, we shouldn't have to make a choice. Well, it's like, you do have to make a choice. The fact that you think you don't have to make a choice is why we're $36 trillion in the hole. You have to make choices. Which comes first, Ukraine or America? You can't do both because we don't have enough money. We only have enough taxes coming in to pay for Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and food stamps. Everything else is borrowed. So maybe able-bodied people need to go back to work. Maybe there needs to be a work requirement. Maybe, for goodness sakes, food stamps shouldn't buy sugar drinks, chips, ding-dongs, and Twinkies. Could we not reform our system such that we try to cure the obesity plague in our country by cutting back what the government buys as far as food? But today the opposite will happen. Things aren't what they appear to be. Things are never in Congress really what they seem to be. We will pass a bill ostensibly by the conservative majority, but the purpose of this bill is to spend $340 billion in new spending. Instead, what we should be doing is taking the savings from waste, fraud, and abuse that DOGE and Elon are finding, we should take those savings and use it to spend for things that people think are of higher priority, such as the border and or the military. But I will oppose this budget because I'm not for spending more money. I will oppose this budget because I want to have nothing to do with a $2.2 trillion deficit. At the end of the year, those who vote for this budget and those who vote for the new spending will have to explain to people at home, how about that $2.2 trillion deficit? How did that happen under a Republican watch? And until someone is brave enough to say no, it's going to go on, and there is a danger. If we don't stop it, we're going to destroy the country. So, Mr. President, I will offer an amendment later on to cut spending, to actually put teeth into this budget resolution, to cut real spending, to balance our budget, and to do and complete the promises that the President had in the campaign. With that, I yield back my time.